Okay, colleagues, and hopefully we're live. Hello and welcome back. I wanted to do this video in response to some confusion among the students. So we started discussing Marx in detail last week, and one of the questions I constantly run into is this issue of what communism really is. What is real communism? And specifically, what is the relationship of communism the way Karl Marx envisioned it and let's say the so-called real existing socialisms, right? Real socialist experiments in the 20th century. So talking primarily about Soviet Russia and Soviet China, right? And so basically, I'm going to try to keep it short, but I want to deal with these questions today. And specifically, I want to give a certain angle, which is maybe somewhat controversial, but this is the way I find most productive, and I will say something, in attempting to justify this from a strictly Marxist position, right? And so my idea would be that we don't have to imagine what communism is like. We actually already live in communism, at least to some extent. Chances are that people who are listening to this video, I'll explain in a bit, fall into that category. So again, real communism in 2021, right? And well, okay, spoiler alert, of course, yes. To give away the punchline, if you want to think about communism, you should probably think of countries like Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark, which are, as I would argue, communist to some extent. And these would be much better examples of real existing communism or communist elements to some extent, rather than the arguably failed experiments of Soviet Russia and Soviet China. Arguably failed because both of these did not manage to succeed in their own terms, right? So the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and China is now pursuing policy of capitalism. Anyway, I'm doing this, sounds controversial, but I'm not trying to be controversial for the sake of being controversial. I usually begin my classes on Marx by saying that Marx is possibly one of the most misunderstood philosophers ever. And there's a bad reason and a good reason for that. The bad reason is that I think Marx got carried away at times, and he could have been clearer, I think, if he wanted to. But also, Marx was a very deep philosopher, very deep thinker, and he was constantly working on the edge of his understanding. And this is why it's so interesting and so stimulating to read Marx today in 2021, because so much of what he has written is still very much relevant, right? But so again, there's a good reason and a bad reason. So the bad reason is, yeah, Marx could have been clearer, but the good reason is that capitalism is complicated, and Marx, as an analyst of capitalism, is trying to expound this, right? So the complication is because the world is complicated, the world is difficult, right? Marx, not rocket science. It's much harder than rocket science. Anyway, so what I tell students in the first class is you should bracket everything you've heard before about Marx. Most of the time, this is good advice. Most of the time, this will be good advice, right? And you have to understand, we have to disabuse ourselves of the false prejudice about Marx. So there's Marx, and there's the socialist experiments of the 20th century. These are not the same things, and I'll talk about this in a second, hopefully. But we have been discussing this in other lectures, right? So hopefully you already know something about this, right? The videos about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy I recorded this morning, right? Talk about this as well. Anyway, so Marx, also, there's a problem with Cold War propaganda. Very often, Marx is demonized and used as a tool in propaganda warfare, regardless of what he wrote, right? So problem number 3 is that Marx versus Marx, right? Marx had this project. This was always a work in progress. He never finished anything. He never published more or less anything. It's like of the approximately, I think, something like 27 volumes of Das Kapital, one was published and it was rushed, and Marx wanted to revise it and was unsatisfied with it. So it's Marx's work is unfinished and tentative, which doesn't mean it's useless. No, it's very useful, right? But we have to keep in mind that it is a work in progress. It is an unfinished project, right? And also, one other thing I want to mention, and this is kind of, it has very much to do with the core of what I'm trying to do here today, right, is that we have to remember that 1848 and 2021, right, are two very different years in the history of humanity, right? And so when Marx talks about communist program, right? When he talks about universal suffrage, when he talks about social welfare, when he talks about the reduced working day, where he talks about to each according to his needs, right? Needs, right? So according to needs, right? So to some extent, we already, I don't want to say all, but some places on the globe in 2021 have this to a lesser or a greater extent, right? So I want to say that communism is not an on-off switch. It is a sliding scale. You can be more in communism or you can be less in communism, right? And I want to say that many places in the world in 2021 are closer to Marx's vision of communism. That's my general contention. If this is not clear, I mean, imagine a following analogy. Talk about democracy. You can think of countries being more democratic or less democratic, right? That kind of makes sense, right? And I want to say in the same fashion, in the similar fashion, you should be able to imagine countries being more communist or less communist. Anyway, I'll get there, right? And lastly, I want to say, so you could say, well, it's a strange way to read Marx, but I want to say, no, this is very true to Marx's own spirit, right? Marx was an anti-utopian thinker. He found utopian very sinister and dangerous and insidious, right? So Marx wanted to always to analyze the real present tendencies, So when we talk about communism, we shouldn't imagine some kind of paradise pie in the sky, which is going to happen who knows when. No. We should look for real present tendencies which exhibit communist elements. And then the way we understand what communism is by extrapolating from these real existing tendencies into the future. That's the idea. Okay, let's continue. So yeah, so again, I talked about this again, sliding scale or a continuum, right? And so more specifically, let's talk about several issues, right? So one is this idea of alienation of labor or alienated labor. Obviously, labor can be more alienated or less alienated, right? So if you imagine a worker in a factory who works for like bare subsistence wage, and they work on a conveyor belt, right? And it's very dehumanizing. It's very stupefying work, right? So this would be like highly alienating, right? But also within capitalism, presumably, if somebody is working in an office, this could still be, broadly speaking, working class, and this could still, broadly speaking, be alienated, but much less alienated labor, right? So there's a sliding scale. Or me recording this video right now. In many ways, if you go through the checklist of what alienation is supposed to be like, to a very large extent, what I'm doing right now is quite voluntary. I mean, I'm sure you can probably find some elements of alienation about what I'm doing right now, but I think it's it's safe to say that my labor of delivering this mini lecture is less alienating than some other forms of work I can imagine, right? But okay, like I'll give it to you. I can imagine in principle even less alienated forms of labor somewhere, in different place, in different conditions. Who knows, right? So labor can be more alienating, less alienating. So in this sense, you can have an arrangement of an economic system which is more alienating, less alienating, and therefore you can say that the organization of mode of production in a given society is closer or farther from the ideal of communism, because overcoming of alienation is one of the key traits of communism. It's, if you want, one of the definitions, if you want, of communism, right? So communism is the mode of production which is supposed to overcome human alienation. Talk maybe more about this in a bit, right? So likewise, you can talk about this issue of from each according to his ability to each according to her need, right? So what kind of needs, right? So I'm going to talk about this, I think, in a future slide. But you can have more or fewer of your needs satisfied, right? So if you talk about free education, free healthcare, maybe free transportation, these kinds of, social security, all that kind of thing, right? Isn't this exactly to each according to his or her need? Isn't that exactly the notion? Like when we hear this phrase for the first time, from each according to her ability to each according to her need, this sounds so utopian and so divorced from reality. Whereas in fact, again, I began with this, Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark, and many other countries in the world, of course, right, already exemplify this mentality of to each according to her need, whatever, right? So to a very large extent, right? And lastly, when we talk about, again, communism, an important trait of communism is this notion of this truly democratic political process, right? More or less functioning real democracy, in terms of transparency, accountability, and access. To a lot of people, it sounds very strange. They think communism is anti-democratic, and I think nothing can be further from the truth, right? So if you read Marx's Civil War in France, his reflections on the Paris Commune, you see Marx's commitment to direct democracy, to representation, to rotation, to the Soviets. This is why the system of council. This is why the Soviet Union was supposedly called the Soviet Union. Of course, in terms of reality, it was a joke. Unfortunately, a tragic joke, I should say, or maybe less of a joke and more just of a tragedy, right? But Marx definitely had this commitment again to individual freedom and also to real democracy. Anyway, so I talked about these couple things. So I talked about alienation. I talked about needs. So alienation number 1 and needs number 2b, right? So let me talk about these slightly more. So again, I did a video this morning about alienation in more depth, so if you want, go watch that. But to briefly recap, so we talk about alienation from a product of labor, from the process of labor, alienation of man from man, or of humans from humans, right? And also this Gattungswesen, which is this German word, hard to explain exactly, usually translated as species being into English, but this communitarian account of individuality, that real freedom is to be found positively in our relations with other people, and that individuals thrive only through their participation in a well-constituted community, right? That's the idea. And again, I'm talking about a sliding scale, so let me elaborate this on this a little bit more, right? So again, a worker in a factory on a conveyor belt doesn't own the product of labor, doesn't control the process of labor, right? When are they going to wake up? Capitalism decides. What are they going to have for dinner? Capitalism decides. When are we going to have a vacation? Never. Capitalism decides, right? So alienation from product, alienation from process, and this idea of man from man, human from human, right? So workers on the shop floor are competing. It's like this, you have this universal competition, war of all against all in the market, right? So people, and I'm talking about this to some of you. This may be tragic, this may be traumatic, this may trigger some very unhappy memories, right? This is a reality for so many people. Their job, their work is like a war zone. Where people are constantly on the lookout, plotting against one another. You get fired and I get a promotion. Yes, right? So this negative, competition, alienation of man from man, right? And okay, the fourth one is kind of more complicated, but let's not necessarily talk about this right now. So, but I want to say again, as a factory worker, it's very clear how you can be more alienated in these terms. Whereas me, right now, I'm recording this lecture. The product is very much mine. I have a recorder. So like this goes on YouTube, it's true. But I also have a recorder. And I'm planning to listen to this maybe next year. This is in fact, my primary motivation for being a philosophy professor is because I enjoy the hell out of philosophy, right? So it's like, I don't want to be megalomaniacal. I'm not John Milton, lamentably. But Marx talks about John Milton. He says, Milton writes Paradise Lost the same way that the worm produces silk. It is an internal necessity. And for me, in very many ways, it is an internal necessity to engage in philosophy. Now, my Buddhist proclivities lead me to question these tendencies to some extent. Am I being attached to my job as a university professor? But and I want to make a note. I want to make a note that there are some questions to be asked here. But be that as it may, let's return to Marx, right? The idea is that again, the product is mine. Year in and year out, I really like listening more than I like reading. I listen to my speeches, I listen to my lectures from past years, and it helps me build my understanding. And I do this, I feel, first and foremost, for myself, because I enjoy it. It's like quasi-Aristotelian notion of this eudaimonia, say hi to Aristotle, right? So this is number one. Second, so I'm talking about product of labor. Process of labor. There are lectures that I give in the university, and I have far less control over that. But right now, what I'm recording for YouTube, or I can upload it somewhere else, or I can just, directly distribute this to students. So many ways of potentially I could go about this, right? But the process of labor is this labor right now. I am in control of that. If I had a headache or if I didn't feel like it, there was no reason for me to record this, right? And maybe also for you, there's no reason to listen to this. Who knows? Right? And listening is also labor if you do it properly. And lastly, again, I keep discussing this alienation of human from human, right? So on the shop floor, everybody is your enemy. The employer is the enemy. Your co-workers are your enemies. The consumer is the enemy, right? So, and there's this conflict of interest everywhere. You want to do as little work as possible, and you want the employer to pay you as much as possible. Your co-workers, if they get fired, maybe you get a promotion, or like, I don't know, if there's a pandemic and people die, then you potentially get paid more, whatever, something like that, right? Or lastly, consumers versus producers. Again, I want to produce the product with as little effort as possible, of the as poor quality as possible, and then shove it onto the consumer, right? And so, I mean, think about all these things about planned obsolescence, right? Selling goods which are intended to break, right? Because this will increase future sales, maybe. So again. So I'm talking about alienation of human from human. But me recording this lecture, I don't feel alienation of human from human, right? In fact, I would love for as many people as possible to listen to this lecture. I'm always keep saying that I'm a big believer in the free university. I think the door should be always open. Anybody who wants to listen to my class, whatever, I don't mind. As long as it doesn't, as long as it's not disruptive, as long as we can still do work, yeah, I'm happy for as many people as possible to do this. If a certain number of people watch this video, leave comments, ask me questions, or if students come later and ask me questions, I'd be more than happy to engage with this. This is the lifeblood, right, of being a teacher. Again, I do not feel that I am in competition with my students. I do not feel that I'm in competition with other professors, let's say. In fact, if I find a text or if I find a lecture which is better than mine on Marx, I am always so happy. I am ecstatic. If there was a perfect lecture on Marx already in existence, I would just memorize that and give it, right? but we're moving forward. We have to move forward, right? So we're standing on the shoulders of the giants, right? This is very much a cooperative enterprise. Competitive maybe also to some extent, in the sense that, yeah, of course you want to give as best a lecture as you can, but it's a different kind of competition, right? It's in important sense, a friendly competition, right? I gave this analogy a while back, a couple of classes ago. I talked about Bohr and Einstein, right? So obviously, Bohr wants to be Niels Bohr wants to be a better physicist than Einstein, and Einstein wants to be a better physicist than Bohr. But it's not a question of Einstein hiring assassins to kill Bohr, right? No, they want to be a better physicist, right? So the challenge is there only if the competition is fair, right? And not to mention that, again, at the end of the day, Bohr and Einstein challenge each other and help each other progress. I look at my fellow professors, and if somebody makes a better lecture than I, yeah, maybe I feel that I could do better, but at the same time, I feel like I benefit from that, and I enjoy listening to a lecture which is better than mine. Okay, so I'm spending quite a bit of time on this, but I want you to see again this reality of alienated labor and reality of less alienated labor, or maybe not. I don't want to be megalomaniacal and say that my labor is not alienated at all. I don't think so, right? But it's much less alienated, right? So when you think about communism, when you think about what communism would be like if everybody lived like this, like university professors would be in communism. And again, notice, right? I keep referring back to this. Right, so university professors, the way science is organized, physics, engineering, this isn't just some incidental fact of life. It's not like if everybody was a painter, okay? If everybody was a painter, we would starve, right? But if everybody is a university professor, this is what science does. This is what technology does. It allows us to master nature with the least expenditure possible, as Marx says, right? And with the greatest human dignity possible, as Marx says, right? So, in fact, if everybody is an artist, society starves. If everybody is a shoemaker, society also starves, right? Because shoemakers produce shoes, but they don't produce, let's say, food, right? But if society is all made of scientists, right, we can find a scientific way of organizing labor in the best way possible, in the most productive way possible. Ideally, this automatization, robotization. Marx obviously did not talk about robots, but of course, the immense increase in the productivity of labor. This is something that he was very keenly aware of. Again, let me pause here and think about the mechanical loom, right? This idea of mechanical loom increases the productivity maybe by 80 times, let's say, right? So in principle, you could work 80 times less. You could work 80 times less and still have the same level of material well-being. Wouldn't that be nice? Right? And again, what do we have instead? Instead, we have the coercive laws of competition in the market. Students of economics hopefully can understand this. Again, like sometimes I'm tempted to say that all of Marx can be summarized as this failed prisoner's dilemma. Failed prisoner's dilemma. That instead of productivity increasing human happiness, instead of that, productivity just increases human misery. And this is the paradox, this is the tension at the root of capitalism, which Marx, I think, so skillfully pointed to. Again, this problem that as humanity becomes more powerful, an individual human being becomes more and more powerless. Right? Okay. So this is alienation. So I promised to talk about A, B, and C, right? So A was alienation, B was needs, satisfaction of needs from each according to her ability to each according to her need. I'm going to talk about this in a second, and we'll talk about the political process. So so let's talk about this needs from each according to her ability to each according to her need, right? And so Marx talks about the basic needs, right? And the basic needs are for sustenance, basic food, warmth, shelter, physical exercise, basic hygiene, procreation, and sexual activity. I'm mostly taking this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I should probably credit them with that. Anyway, I'll add the links to the description. Well, I'm following up from the video I did this morning, right? So then you can have less basic needs, but these are also important to satisfy. Need for recreation, for culture, for intellectual stimulation, for artistic expression, emotional satisfaction, and aesthetic pleasure, right? And again, now tell me that Soviet Russia or Soviet China were communist. It's not true. And by the way, in their own terms, they were never communist. They were socialist on the way to building communism, but they were never officially communist because they've read enough of Karl Marx. As poor as the reading of Karl Marx might have been in the Soviet Union, they've understood enough of Karl Marx to see that they are not really in communism, right? And ultimately, what we're dealing with communism, right, is we're talking about fulfilling work, which is the economic dimension of life, and meaningful community, which is the political dimension of life. And again. Well, I think I have another slide about this, right? So maybe I want to talk about this right now. Yeah. So from each according to her ability to each according to her need, right? What kind of needs? What does it mean? This is not a utopian phrase. Again, this is a picture from the Wikipedia article on per capita spending on social welfare programs. Now, of course, this is a very rough estimate. Don't take this with a tablespoon of salt. Okay, nobody suggests that there's a simple, straightforward fashion in which you can just say, oh, the more you spend on social welfare programs, the more communist you are. No, I'm not saying that. The social welfare spending can be extremely inefficient. And the government spending on social welfare can be eaten up by government bureaucracies, right? Or by big pharma or something like that, right? So it's this number should be taken with a grain of salt. But still, again, to the extent that human beings are provided with use values, not exchange values, but use values, real use values, which is why I think this, as Marx says, I think there should be suspicion against universal basic income, because universal basic income wants to provide you with exchange values. But we don't want universal basic income. We want universal basic needs. So not UBI, but UBN, universal basic needs satisfied, right? So such as free education, free healthcare, public libraries, maybe free transportation, like in Luxembourg. Look it up. Luxembourg has free transportation, right? It's quite amazing, right? But also maybe accountable, transparent political process. These are the countries. If you think of communism, don't think of don't think of Stalin and the Gulag. Think of Norway, okay? This is the upshot. This is the takeaway point from this video. Not 100%, but on the way, I want to say. Okay. So there's a wonderful quote from Marx, Das Kapital, Volume 3. And the upshot of the quote is that communism is the shortening of the length of the working day, okay? Communism is the shortening of the length of the working day. The quote itself is quite long, and I'm not sure if we'll read it in full again. So, communism is, it's an oversimplification, okay? So take it with a grain of salt, but still, is the shortening of the working day. Well, again, technically speaking, the shortening of the working day is the basic prerequisite of communism, right? But notice, right? In the quote unquote real socialism, real existing socialisms, right? What happens is that usually you don't get the decrease of the length of the working day. You actually have the increase of the length of the working day, right? And that's a bit of a cue that you are not exactly talking about communism, really. Okay. So the wonderful quote, and this is from Volume 3 of Das Kapital. Well, actually, you know what? Maybe let's read it, right? So he talks about this true human emancipation, communism, the realm of freedom. He says that the realm of freedom begins only when labor, which is determined by necessity and mundane consideration, ceases. By course of laws of competition in the market, maybe also as well. Thus, in the very nature of things, the realm of freedom lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. Just as savage must wrestle with nature to satisfy his wants, to maintain and reproduce life, so must civilized man, and civilized man must do so under all possible modes of production, presumably including communism, right? With the development of the realm of physical necessity, the wants expand. The wants of a human being expand, but at the same time, the force of production also increase. So it's important, right? Communism is not a more primitive society. No, we're moving forward. There's going to be more needs, and we're going to satisfy them even more, even greater. How does this square with ecology? How does this square with global warming and climate change and pollution? I think there should be an answer. I think there should be an answer to this question. This is definitely, I think, to some extent, a challenge and an issue for Marx. And there should be an answer. And I think that there is an answer. And in fact, I want to say that the communist answer is the best answer, as far as I can tell, to these questions. But I'll get there. Okay, hopefully in a moment. Anyway, so freedom in the realm of necessity. So presumably, in communism, you will also have the realm of necessity. Freedom in the realm of necessity can only consist in socialized man, the associated producers, rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control instead of being ruled by it as a blind force of nature, right? So think about the course of laws of competition in the market. And again, so we are talking about associated producers, rational plan. And I want to stress, if you do your little calculation and if you decide that, let's say, market forces are simply more economically efficient and, market is the way to go. Well, I don't think, this is anathema to most Marxists, obviously, but I don't think that in principle you couldn't have communism with elements of the market. I think you could even have communism with some elements of money economy in it. Now, I'm not sure, it's a whole can of worms, but you know what is the test? If human beings are in charge, if we have this real functioning democracy, collective deliberation, and if we only listen to peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, then it's communism. Even if it has money, even if it has property, it's communism. If people are not in charge, then it's not communism. Okay? If there's a party leader who's in charge, or if there's a class of bureaucrats who's in charge, then we're not in communism, right? So it's important to keep in mind. Anyway, yeah. So and Marx talks about associate producer achieving this with the least expenditure of energy under conditions most favorable to and worthy of our human nature. But nonetheless, it remains the realm of necessity. So this is, if you want, the necessary division of labor. And then we have the voluntary division of labor. Beyond it begins that development of human energy, which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only with the realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day is its basic prerequisite. In many ways, I feel that this is maybe the most important quote from all of Marx. Okay. I hope it's clear enough at this stage. Let's continue. So, So I promised. I said A, alienation. B, to each according to her needs. And C, what about the state? So, again, let's think about this sliding scale and a continuum of democracy, right? Democracy. People are in charge. People are in charge. What does it mean? So I'm talking about a functioning democratic process, right? So think of people like Jürgen Habermas or actually Michael Bourgeois, right? So this ideal of, think of John Stuart Mill, think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, maybe think of John Stuart Mill, right? We have this free and equal discussion. We have this peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, right? right? So you have this communicative rationality, communication, public deliberation, transparency, accountability. To the extent that we are governed by transparent, accountable political processes, to the extent that people have access, to the extent that there's a real public deliberation, real public discussion, debate, and throughout this free and equal discussion, we actually work out the best way to solve the problems that face us, or to satisfy the needs that we have, right? To this extent, I want to say we already live in communism. And very clearly, again, it's a sliding scale. Some countries, by this standard, right, would be more democratic. Some countries would be less democratic, right? And so Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark. Although it's hard to not remember about the international world order, right? And Luxembourg and Denmark and Norway, to a large extent, exist at the mercy of the United States of America. The United States spends more than the rest of the world combined, right, on military expenditure, and the arms of the American soldiers, in an important sense, shield and protect this socialist, this communist experiment that's going on in Norway and in Denmark, right? And I think this has to be kept in mind, which is why I want to say that Norway and Denmark are communist to some extent, but they're not really communist with a capital C, partly because, again, communism is only possible as world communism, and again, these are enclaves. These are experiments shielded from the forces of the outside world by the American nuclear shield. Something for us to keep in mind, I think, right? But still, to the extent that real public deliberation carries the day, you could say that these countries are already in communism. This is what communism would look like. Again, you don't have to imagine. You can look and see and extrapolate. What if the entire world was like Denmark, right? Is this a possibility, right? And very importantly, we need to have a contrast to understand what communism is not. Right? So you can think of, again, coercive laws of market competition. You can think of coercive laws of state bureaucracy, something that Max Weber talks about. And not just Weber, but also Habermas and Burawoy talk about this as well, right? And this is the idea that Habermas and Burawoy are going to say that we need to protect civil society, and they use this term differently from Marx. Marx has a technical definition of civil society, but basically, Marx by civil society, he means the market, right? And here, Habermas and Burawoy talking about civil society mean, again, this sphere, public sphere. Okay, let me say, protect the public sphere, okay? Public sphere, a sphere of free public deliberation. Protect it against the market and the state, right? But also you can also think of, so coercive laws of market, coercive logic of state bureaucracy, and also coercive logic of patrimonial informal institutions, corruption, right? Because sometimes decisions are made not in the service of this governmental bureaucracy and not in the service of coercive laws of market competition, but sometimes we see things such as the nepotism, right? Shaking hands under the table, that kind of thing, like real corruption. So in this sense, in a quasi-Weberian fashion, I think I'll talk about Weber in a second, right? I want to see this, like the reality as a combination of ideal types. No country is perfect, right? But to a lesser or to a greater extent, these forces and maybe other forces control what's actually going on, right? And when you look at it this way, I think it should be very clear. It should be very clear that, well, I don't want to say it should be very clear, but let me suggest that we should never take communism for granted. Communism is not this eternal paradise, but communism is a result of this real struggle between these forces. So let me write this. So communism is not an eternal paradise, with a question mark, because again we are discussing maybe communism is a result of a perpetual struggle against subversive forces. In the same fashion, and let's say compare this to democracy, right? Well, and again, communism is democracy for Marx, is the real realization of the ideal of functioning democracy, right? But the idea is that if a country once achieves democracy, this is not a guarantee that the country will stay democratic into the future. Anything could happen. You can have an emergence of an elite. Something happens, I don't know, external intervention, war, or maybe some kind of, climatic disaster, or right? In principle, democracy. This is like the erotic dream of many political theorists. Democracy can always vote itself out of existence. You know, if a country has real democracy, of course, the people can always vote to give up democracy, right? So in this sense, democracy is not forever. And in the same fashion, I would say communism is not necessarily forever. Now, this is not really the way Marx wrote about this. I think Marx, in his more optimistic moments, he got carried away and he wrote as if communism is this paradise, and you know, once we achieve it, it's never gonna go. And I feel that again, Marx was being too optimistic when he wrote these things. Okay, I think he was too optimistic. So in this sense, I am kind of slightly disagreeing with Marx, I say, or reading Marx slightly maybe against the grain of the core of his argument, right? And I want to see what Marx is talking about here is ideal types, right? So this is a famous phrase coined by Max Weber, but of course it's just an ideal of a model. So everybody uses ideal types, and people have been using ideal types even before Max Weber. So an ideal type is an idealized analytical model. It captures important aspects of reality, and it's, if you want, approximately true. But reality is not ideal types. Reality is not ideal types. But reality may be adequately captured or sufficiently adequately captured by a combination of several, 2, 3, 5, many ideal types, depending on the amount of precision you want, right? So the reality is a combination of potentially a lot, maybe infinite, a combination of ideal types. But again, if you want sufficient precision, it's usually several ideal types give you the best mileage, right? And so in this sense, I want to say that Marx talks about feudalism, capitalism, communism. Feudalism, capitalism, and communism, I want to see them as ideal types, and our reality as combination of these ideal types. And in many ways, right? So we have, this is the ideal type of communism. This, the functioning of democratic process, the coercive laws of market competition, this is the ideal type of capitalism, and the coercive laws of patrimonial informal institutions, this is the ideal type of feudalism. Now, coercive laws of state bureaucracy, Marx is kind of, Marx's theory of the state is underdeveloped, and I feel that this is something that Marx failed to appreciate, how, again, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels very famously write that the state is just a committee for managing the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, but probably the state is actually much more than that, and the state can actually, regulate the market, regulate capitalism, and save capitalism from itself. This is a hugely important point in Marx. Okay. So actually, this is precisely my next point, right? So actually, the state versus the market is a deeply misleading dichotomy. And I want to say that so many debates, I feel, completely miss the point. People are saying, well, things should be solved by free market, or no, things should be solved by state intervention. As if these are the only two options. Again, notice in my chart, I have democracy, I have coercive laws of the market, I have coercive logic of the state, and also, corruption and patrimonialism. These are at least four elements, and trying to reduce them to the two, the state and the market, usually is going to lead to failure, right? So let me talk briefly about this. So state capitalism is capitalism, not communism. State capitalism is capitalism, not communism. So if you have a classist society, if your society is made of classes, and there's a ruling class who control the means of production and appropriate the surplus, and there's a working class who are forced to work to produce the surplus but don't get the surplus, right? You are living in a form of capitalism. And in this sense, I think it's very clear and very obvious that Soviet Russia and Soviet China were not communist, they were capitalist. They were simply state capitalist. Instead of the traditional class of the bourgeoisie controlling the means of production, you now have the class of state bureaucrats controlling the means of production. And likewise, if you think about, modern day America, I think it's also, I'm not an expert, but I would imagine that to some extent, right, America is ruled by the coercive laws of competition in the market. But a huge sector of American economy is actually directly controlled by the government. And so this is in control, in the hands of state bureaucracy, which is not really accountable to the people. So it's a different kind of an elite. So maybe America is a combination of free market capitalism with state capitalism. But, so the economy, state versus the market, are we talking about state capitalism versus market capitalism? It's a deeply misleading dichotomy because you're choosing between two evils, right? And communism, I would say, is not really about the state and is not really about the market. It's about the public sphere. Again, der zwanglosen Zwang des besseren Arguments, right? The peculiarly unforced force of the better argument carrying the day, and not the coercive laws of competition in the market or the coercive logic of governmental bureaucracy, right? And in this sense, okay, this is going to be explosive and people get upset, but please, colleagues, understand that in a certain important respect, right? So there is, I don't want to minimize this. But it's like Soviet Russia and the Nazi Germany from classical Marxist perspectives, are not particularly different. Again, I'm going to refer to an article by Daniel Woodley, I think a wonderful article, talking about fascism from a Marxist perspective. But the idea is basically we are deploying instruments of state terror to coerce, we're abolishing trade unions, we're abolishing workers' rights, and we are deploying the force of the state apparatus to force the people to work. And in this sense, Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany are not that far apart. Okay, I'm not talking about the concentration camps. Well, I am talking about the concentration camps to some extent. I'm not trying to equate these two regimes completely, right? But there's a certain important similarity. In an important sense, you see important elements of state capitalism in both countries. Although, of course, nominally Nazi Germany was, had free market, had corporations and all the rest of them, but there's an important element which unites them, right? And so communism, capitalism, fascism, all of this is deeply misleading. There's more to be said about this, and I think I'll try to make a video in the future about this. But the upshot is we shouldn't look, again, Soviet Russia and Soviet China. This is state capitalism. This is not communism in any shape, matter, or form, and this is not the reduction of length of the working day, and this is not the realm of freedom or the true human emancipation. And in this sense, Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark are much closer to the ideal of communism. If you understood this, I think I've done my job. Okay. So there's a couple more things I want to talk before I wrap up this mini lecture or whatever, right? So I said that Luxembourg, Norway, and Denmark are already, to a large extent, to some extent, communism. When I say to some extent, do I mean maybe 30% or maybe 60%? That's a very big range. I'm not sure, okay? It's a difficult, complicated question, and I'm not trying to finish the discussion. I'm trying to start. This is a discussion starter, basically, right? But what is important is to understand that, again, in the works of Marxists after Marx, especially associated with the wonderful Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, right? We have this notion of concessions. So we have the new international division of labor, right? And we should talk less about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and talk more about bourgeois countries and proletarian countries, as Wallerstein would call this, or Wallerstein would call this, countries of the core and countries of the periphery, right? So, and Lenin actually pointed this out. He used the phrase bourgeoisification of the proletariat, right? So how in the first world countries, the bourgeoisie shares some of the crumbs from the table, to the proletariat. Again, remember, Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, workers have nothing to lose but their chains. They must unite. Well, if you throw them some crumbs from the table, now they have something to lose. And instead of trying to go beyond capitalism, maybe now workers find it more appealing to try to work for concessions within capitalism, right? Rather than overthrowing capitalism, right? And so, yeah, bourgeoisification of the proletariat. But notice still, even the bourgeoisie, very importantly for Marx, is alienated. I suppose another video is in order, or you can watch the video from this morning. I talk about it there, right? So even the bourgeoisie is alienated. Still, it may feel psychologically, it may be more comfortable, but this is still alienation for Marx. And also, we should remember that ideology is ideology. Sometimes people just think that they have been bourgeoisified and everything is fine and they're bourgeoisie, they're in control of their lives. But in fact, they're not. Right? And again, what I'm trying to say is that I think that Denmark and Norway are still mostly capitalist countries. So when I say 30 to 60%, maybe I should say 30 to 40%. But mostly we're still talking about capitalism. Especially since, again, Norway and Denmark do not exist in a vacuum. They exist with the protection of the United States, and also they exist by benefiting from the labor of the workers in the third world countries, in places like China and India and Africa. Manufacture and mining of resources taking place outside all this wonderful labor rights which we have in the OECD countries, right? And so this was my point. So first world versus third world, the new international division of labor. Wallerstein talks about this, right? But also, importantly, we have to remember, right? So in the first world, we have, for example, corporations which exploit people abroad. And now, by exploiting people abroad, they accumulate vast amounts of money. And having exploited people abroad, they come back home, and now they inject big money in politics. this leads to the corruption of the democracy. This leads to the enormous corruption of the democracy, right? And so exploitation abroad isn't just a humanitarian problem. It's not just out of the kindness of the heart that we should care about, exploiting people in other countries. No, if you allow people to basically have slaves, people or corporations, they will acquire disproportionate wealth that they can leverage at home and subvert the normal functioning of democracy. I'm talking about this in 2021. Yeah, America, I'm looking at you. United States of America, I'm looking at you, right? And okay, we have this wonderful word in the American sense of the term, republicanism. This notion that America is not a democracy, it's a republic. Because supposedly we should have this system of checks and balances to prevent mob rule. Well, let me tell you something. Oligarchy is not a system of checks and balances. Yeah. So oligarchy is not direct democracy, but also I think there's a good reason to be very, very suspicious of this use of the word republicanism, okay? As a professor of political philosophy, we use the word republic very differently, okay? And I'm not sympathetic to that to that use because, that's a topic for a video for another day. But again, what I'm trying to say is this: that oligarchy is checks and balances. Yes, we need a system of checks and balances. Rousseau talks about the dangers of direct democracy. Direct democracy, is open to certain abuses. And I think, again, Marxists should be on board with that. So we don't necessarily want direct democracy in this most immediate sense. So maybe we do want, again, as Rousseau talks about also, a system of checks and balances. But an oligarchy, which prevents real direct democracy, is something else, right? And we don't want that. Anyway. And lastly, I want to say, right, so we talk about Norway and Denmark, but what about global challenges? Norway and Denmark cannot solve, let's say, the climate change all on their own, right? As long as the whole world is mostly ruled by the coercive laws of competition in the market. And again, ask yourself, why haven't we solved global warming, climate change, right? Why cannot we solve CO2 emissions? Because the first, it's a game of chicken. The first country that reduces emissions majorly loses a competitive advantage against other countries, right? So fossil fuels allow this temporary short-sighted boost in efficiency and profits. And again, we are talking about coercive laws of competition in the market, efficiency for efficiency's sake, profit for the profit's sake. And who cares about the future for our children? Right? Is this a conscious change? And you see, that's the problem. Communism for Marx is possible only as world communism for many reasons, including for this reason. The challenges that we face are global challenges. So solving climate change, solving the problem of pollution, solving the problem of pandemics. This pandemic, deeply tragic and unfortunate, many people have suffered completely unnecessarily. There's plenty of resources in the world that could have been distributed, and they were not distributed, not for economic reasons. Starvation in 2021 is not because of lack of productivity. It is for political reasons. If you want people starve in 2021, only because there's political will that people starve in 2021. If there was political will to make sure everybody's fed, there's no reason this could not have been done. Logistically speaking, it's not a problem. It is a result of a deliberate political decision, which may be motivated by coercive laws of competition in the market or whatever, but still, we have to understand and treat it as such, right? And lastly, I've added this, but it's kind of, I think, it's a bit more sci-fi or whatever, but the danger of asteroids, right? It's also a danger. Again, if we were rational as humanity, we would definitely spend more resources on looking out in the sky, finding asteroids which potentially might hit the Earth, and try to divert them while we can. And we are not spending nearly enough proportionate to the danger that this could cause. There are other I'm sure there are other global challenges. Sometimes people talk about solar flares, and again, why our electrical infrastructure is not actually protected against the solar flares for precisely the same reason, because coercive laws of competition in the market don't care about the future. They don't care about tomorrow. Capitalism doesn't care about tomorrow. It only cares about, let's say, the profits, the profit margin, or rate of profit in the next month or in the next quarter, right? Anyway. So going back to this question, how do you know if we are living in communism or not? So I talked about this already. So I don't think I need to go back. And I wanted to sort of finish, well, with Antonio Gramsci. And maybe I should. So Gramsci has this wonderful phrase, Pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. Pessimismo dell'intelligenza, ottimismo della volontà. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. There's good reason, good Marxist reason, to suppose that if you look carefully at the way capitalism is organized, and the way the modern system is organized, is that, again, I'm talking about Denmark, Norway, Sweden, maybe a couple of other countries, but still, it's a minority. It's a tiny minority of the population of the Earth. And what is the roadmap? What is the roadmap of how we can make the whole world like Denmark and Norway, right? So I think it's possible. We have a proof of concept that communism can really work in reality. But at the same time, we also see challenges. And I want to say that I think I had I had this slide, right? So real communism, examples of real, proof of concept. And for me, the proof of concept that communism can work would be things such as the country of Luxembourg, Wikipedia, it's a home assignment. Think about why communism, why Wikipedia can be legitimately seen as communist. Luxembourg, Wikipedia, Linux. So I'm talking about open source software, right? But also maybe the Large Hadron Collider and the International Space Station. Again, are they driven by the motivation of profit for profit's sake, or is this genuine human scientific interest? With a question mark, I'll leave it up to you to discuss, right? So these are some causes for optimism, but also there are causes for pessimism. Again, mostly when we talk about bourgeoisification of the proletariat, the system of concessions, it's hard to see the roadmap. But again, we have these proofs of concept, proofs of work, right? Proofs of concept. Like Wikipedia and Linux. So there is some cause for optimism, but also cause for pessimism. And basically, I have a bit of a bipolar disorder when I talk about Marx or when I think about Marx. On my pessimistic days, I think we're all lost and communism is impossible and humanity will destroy itself very soon, possibly in my lifetime. But on my optimistic days, I think that der Zwanglos und Zwang des besseren Arguments, right? The peculiarly unforced force of the better argument can actually carry the day. This is my hope. Anyway, so Gramsci very famously talked about this concept of war of movement and war of position, and he talked about how in the authoritarian states like Tsarist Russia, what communists need to do is they need to engage in war of movement. They need to violently take control of the state apparatus. But then it's not enough. Then they need to gradually build up the appropriate institutions to foster, to enable this real democracy, right? One thing that you need in order for the vast majority of the country, vast majority of people to participate in the Soviets, in the councils, is they need to have free time. And if there's scarcity, if the productive forces are underdeveloped, if you live in a backward peasant country, it's impossible to, for most people to spend so much time, again, on engagement, active engagement in politics, which is what Marx wanted, actually, right? So, in Russia, the war of movement, maybe with a question mark, was won, but the war of position was lost. And we know that it was lost in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell, okay? But Gramsci talks about the West. And he says, in the West, you cannot engage in the war of movement. Because in the West, you have institutions of civil society. You have hegemony in the schools, in the media, right? And so any attempt to simply, grab the state with violence, this will not be well received by the population at large. So you cannot engage in the war of position, and you cannot and shouldn't engage in the war of movement. So instead, you should engage in war of position, right? And the war of position is basically, he talked about these organic intellectuals versus the traditionalist intellectuals of this capitalist hegemony. So these will be the people who are organically tied to the working class, who come from the working class, who have their interests in the working class, and who gradually, bit by bit, try to organize an ideological counter-struggle against capitalist hegemony, in schools, in churches, on television, on YouTube maybe, etc., right? And Gramsci talks about very explicitly, right? So hegemony is basically a combination of concessions and ideology. And again, remember, concessions are not bourgeoisification of the proletariat. Concessions are not communism, right? And the idea is that, again, the ruling class misrepresents its interest as the interest of all people. And if you can have this momentum, if the organic intellectuals will start pushing, and through this peculiarly unforced force of the better argument, through public discussion, will gradually move this in the opposite direction, right? Create, if you want, a communist counter-hegemony, then humanity has a chance. Pessimismo, dell'intelligenza, ottimismo, della, volontà, right? And notice, we are talking here about real political struggle. Communism, for Gramsci, is not inevitable in this sense. We are talking about real political struggle, and this is not this vulgar economic determinist reading of Marx, right? The idea that, people must, the changes in the economic base can be determined with the precision of the natural science, but men must become conscious of the class conflict in their consciousness. They must become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. It's a real political struggle, which one can win or one can lose. So I'll leave you with this. Well, okay, I could write socialism or barbarism, because I write this every class. But, let me leave you with this wonderful Italian: Pessimismo, dell'intelligenza, ottimismo, della, volontà. Let's hope that this was stimulating and interesting to you. I hope this was not a waste of time. So, colleagues, thank you so much for joining me today. Alienation of men from men. No, we're overcoming alienation of men from men. This is the community. Again, I'm not your teacher, you're not my students. We are colleagues, we're partners in this intellectual enterprise. So colleagues, dear colleagues, stay safe, take care, and hopefully I will see you next time. Take care, and hopefully I will see you next time.